So we're still answering the J. Krog 08's accusations of Holocaust denial, and the reason that I want to address this first is because this is one of the ugliest insinuations that can be arraigned against any individual. Certainly anyone who is making a statement who is accused of that is being insulted incredibly. Certainly the last thing that we are dealing with is some form of anti-Semitism, and in order to emphasize that, it needs to be emphasized that the Japanese had taken the position of helping the Jews to relocate in a nation state in East Asia, which I have gone into some detail on during the Coast to Coast AM show when I was talking about the Pearl Harbor attack, and also on the Dr. Stanley Monteith's show, which can be accessed through radioliberty.com. So I went into quite a bit more of detail on that on his show. But essentially, to make it understandable for people, what had happened was that in 1904, during the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese had ground to a halt in terms of their war efforts against the Russians due to the extreme poverty of their nation and their lack of natural resources, namely petroleum. But they were bailed out during the war by a Jewish American named Jacob Schiff, who had lost half of his family to Tsarist Russian pogroms. And as a result, Japan was able to carry the war to a victorious conclusion. So upon victory, the Japanese perspective towards the Jewish minority worldwide was one of obligation in the sense of samurai payback for the life saved and the save of face and the save of honor that needed to be repaid in turn. So what happened was that in 1934, less than a year after Adolf Hitler was voted into office, the Japanese Foreign Ministry formally announced that it would expedite the resettlement of 50,000 German Jews in Manchuria. So all of the Japanese government documents that dealt with this particular program were wound up at the Presidio military base because they were confiscated by Allied occupation forces shortly after the ceasefire in 1945 and relocated. And for the most part, some such documents were made duplicate. Many exact copies were in Washington, D.C. I'm sure that they're still accessible. They may even be decoded, but of course at the time that I was dealing with them, they were ordered destroyed. So what these documents concerned was a Japanese government instigated confidential joint research report titled Study and Analysis of Introducing Jewish Capital, which amounted to a mere 90 pages of translated documentation by the time I was assigned to destroy it, although the volumes in Japanese were no less than 10 very thick books containing onion skin reports, studies, and orders that were stamped Maruhai, meaning secret, and served as a foundation for a large-scale Jewish investment in the Japanese Empire. In 1938, actually at Adolf Hitler's suggestion, the Japanese lost no less than 20,000 men fighting the Soviets in order to establish a space above Manchuria for the Jews to resettle in the face of two wars that took place called Nomonhan and Khalkhin-Gol in Russian. And this map happens to be an English translation of a Russian atlas. You will never find that tiny nation, its capital is Birovdiran, and you will never find that tiny nation on any map printed in the United States. Every single map in the United States that shows Russia or China will not have that buffer nation between the borders. And you would have to look on the web or Google or search engine the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, because after the Russian invasion of Manchuria, the Russians absorbed the Jewish Autonomous Oblast and would have destroyed it if Stalin hadn't died at the time that he did. And more explanation on that in a few moments. But it's important to emphasize that there are nations on the planet that Americans are not even aware of that exist. And so with that as a foundation for some level of the lack of American cultural awareness in terms of interacting with other cultures, when people throw out these accusations of Holocaust denial and whatnot, they're truly smearing with no other intent than a form of demonization In 1939, at the time that these papers were circulated that I am speaking of, there were more Jewish refugees in Shanghai than all British, French, and American nationals combined. Plus the German and Austrian Ashkenazim were still pouring into Shanghai at the rate of 1,000 a month. So Sir Victor Sassoon, known as the J.P. Morgan of the Orient, was president of the Shanghai Stock Exchange at this time, and over a third of its 99 members were Sephardic Jews. He himself was Sephardim, whose family had hailed from Iraq and had established David Sassoon and Sons Limited in the 1840s. Tokyo enrolled this capital and its talents and financial skills from all of the incoming European Jewry to establish an Israel in Manchuria and develop a secure buffer zone against the menace of Soviet encroachment. And this was the foundation for the term the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. Ultimately, 1 million Jews, including many experienced industrialists and technicians, settled the wilderness of Birobidzhan, the frontier capital of Jewish Manchuria. And the national language was Yiddish. And today's Jewish Autonomous Oblast, I believe, still publishes a Yiddish newspaper. If one were to Google or search engine it, they would find out that that tiny nation is actually looking for tourism to bring in some extra income. I wouldn't recommend it for the senior or the elderly because it is very much a frontier zone. But at least it will prove to the Americans that what I speak of is true. By September 1939, Senpo Sugihara, who was ultimately identified as the Japanese Schindler, was assigned a consul in Kovno, Lithuania, under direct orders from the emperor to expedite Jewish immigration to the Japanese home islands themselves. This matter was deemed so urgent because Britain and France had just declared war on Germany, and they cut off the flow of refugees through the international city of Shanghai. Sugihara personally signed thousands of transit visas until the Soviet Union invaded and annexed Lithuania in 1940, even to the point where Sugihara was literally signing and throwing them out of the window of the trains that the Soviets had expelled them on to crowds of Jewish families that were following the train as far as they could run, as far as they could and as fast as they could run. It's important to remember that the Soviet Union, not the Third Reich, shut down Japanese immigration operations in Lithuania. Then at that time, unfortunately, the United States Secretary of State, Morgenthau, who was the Henry Kissinger of his time, told FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, that the capital influence and sympathy of American Jewry reinforced the Japanese war machine. The Japanese Judaic co-affluence was an incalculable threat to American dominance in the Pacific, that their connections to United States press, broadcast media, and film industry was something that needed to be destroyed, because at this point the Japanese nation was the only colored population on Earth with direct commercial and intelligence assets into white markets the world over. And this is one of the primary reasons for American hostility and the attempt to bomb Japan, which I outlined in my coast-to-coast interview with George Norrie. And if anyone disbelieves this, they can verify the fact that it was Secretary of State Morgenthau who instituted stricter U.S. immigration regulations to prevent Jewish-affiliated insurgencies, as he termed them, basically immigration into the United States throughout the war. After the war, towards the end of the war, when the Soviet Union invaded into Manchuria, Stalin kept the Jewish nation as a